Okay. All right, so this is the layout of the section. So this is an important part. So recently the GMAT has undergone some changes in terms of how many questions you get in each section and what is the order of the sections that you get. So earlier it used to be AWA and then IR and then quant and then verbal, but now you have many more options. So this is the structure of the verbal section. You have 36 questions to complete in 65 minutes. And what I talked about in detail in the previous class was how the first 10 questions and the last 6 questions are extremely important, because the first 10 questions will ensure that you reach a good level in terms of the difficulty level of the questions, and then all you have to do is maintain that level. You don't need to go any like beyond that particular level. So you already reach about a 700 level if you do the first 10 questions correct. Same goes for the last few questions. If you are able to get all of these questions correct, that means you're ending at a very good level. So even if, let's suppose, your level was not very high in the first few questions, that means in the middle few questions, if you're able to get the last few questions, all of them correct, it increases, and that means you end the exam on a good level. And same is for the first 10 questions. You start and you just need to maintain that particular level, which is already a high enough level. So the first 10 questions are going to be extremely important, but they will not be very hard. Most probably you will see about 5 to 6 sentence correction questions in that. So those should be pretty easy because they are at the beginning of the test. So you should be able to get these first 10 questions correct. And you may not be able to get those questions correct every time you take a practice test. So initially you start with getting at least the first 3 questions correct, and then the first 5 questions, and slowly build it to the first 10 questions correct. So since they're extremely important but not so hard, you should try and complete them in the first 15 minutes. And then for the last 6 questions, which are going to be really tough but extremely important as well, you should again give them 15 minutes. Now this is approximately, this is more than 2 minutes per question, but that's completely worth it. And in the middle, you spend just about 35 minutes because you have more of the experimental questions here. And these are those questions where you can still get 4 correct, 1 wrong, 4 correct, 1 wrong, and you can still maintain that level that you have achieved from the first few questions. So that should be ideally the time in which you break apart the section. If you want, you can take a 1-minute break in the middle of the section if you're on time, but these are either the times which you can keep track of, or you can keep track of the questions that you've completed. So just be aware of the time in these 4 different zones. The next important thing is the question types. Now, sentence correction is roughly more than 1/3 of the questions. So you have 36 questions and you get about 13 of those from sentence correction. These are extremely scoring, and this needs to be your strength. And whenever you do practice tests and practice questions, I'm not saying that from the first day onwards you should be able to do 13 sentence correction questions in about 15 minutes, but that should be your target as you go forward. Similarly, for critical reasoning, you need to spend about 1 to 1.5 minutes per question, and that will take you about 12 to 15 minutes for every 10 questions. For reading comprehension passages, for each passage, you need about 4 minutes. That should be comfortable to give you a very good idea of what the passage is all about. And then about a minute on each question. You don't need more than a minute because you've already read the passage in detail, so you don't need to spend more time on that. Okay, so is everything fine till now? Any questions on this, the structure or question types?
No, not for me.
Okay, all right. So there were some general strategies that I talked about, which is scratch paper work. It is useful for the quantitative section, but equally important for the verbal section. So I'm going to talk about the scratch paper work in more detail once we move on to sentence correction and critical reasoning. The second thing is you need to take a 30-second break in the middle if you're on track, but that's completely your wish if you want to take that or not. Another strategy which is important is if you have a choice, try to keep the essay at the complete end because that is time consuming and it's also exhausting, but it does not require so much of mental focus and concentration that you need to do it with a fresh mind. And this is something that was very relevant when the older version of GMAT existed, which is when you had the AWA, then the IR, then quant, and then verbal. So verbal section is usually at the end, and that is when you are completely mentally exhausted after doing the quant section and after doing all the other sections. So I used to recommend students to even practice verbal when they're already tired so that you get into that habit of not doing verbal questions with a very fresh mind. But in this case, when you have a lot of options or shuffling around the section, try to take a few practice tests and then figure out what works for you personally and then practice verbal according to that. So there's nothing different in the test when you're actually taking it. And the next very, very, very important point that I want you to implement starting from the first day of your practice is a review log. You need to keep track of all the errors that you make. And this is when you're doing the practice questions as well as when you're taking the practice tests. And ensure that you learn something from every error. For example, in sentence correction, there are not going to be more than maybe 100 rules. And it's the same 100 rules that are tested again and again. You won't get anything new apart from them. So it's very important that you keep track of every learning point that you get from each question, including what you learn in this class. So either you're going to get a question wrong because you did not know something, for example, a grammar rule in sentence correction. In that case, write it down somewhere. And this again goes for this class that we are having. Or you may get something wrong because you knew it. When you look at the solution, you realize that you knew it, but you did not recognize it once the question was in front of you. So it's very important to repeat that knowledge because students often get the same kind of error wrong again and again. Even in critical reasoning, it's the same mistakes that students make again and again. For example, they did not read the question stem correctly enough, or they did not read the argument carefully enough, or they missed something. So these kinds of errors are very, very common. And then an important thing is go over these regularly. So these will kind of, help you make a list of what is important, and you can go through that list once before the real test, or you can go through that on a regular basis. So that's the importance of the review log, and I strongly encourage you to maintain that. So this is sentence correction that we did last time. So we did a few sentence correction strategies, which included the importance of the option A. So you don't have to read the first option in sentence correction because it's the same as in the original question. And secondly, each option has an equal probability of turning up as the answer. So about 20% of the times, option A is going to be the correct answer. And then we talked about punctuation, how the semicolon is the only punctuation that is used or tested in GMAT. And there are only two cases where you use the semicolon. One is when you have a full clause. So clause is like a sentence in the middle of another sentence. So it has to make complete sense on its own. So the semicolon is used when you are separating two clauses, two complete sentences. So you have to make sure that what comes before a semicolon and after a semicolon need to be complete standalone sentences. And the second case where the semicolon is used is when you have a list of lists. And that is usually in the longer sentences that involve errors of parallelism. So suppose you have a list of 3 items, A, B, and C, and then some other action is being performed on other 3 items. And then finally, there is a final list of a few more items. So to separate these, you need the semicolons, semicolon here and an and here. And the third important point is GMC, which refers to grammar, and then meaning, and then concision. So that means when you get 5 options in sentence correction, the first thing that you use to eliminate the wrong options is going to be grammar. So let's say out of 5 options, you have these 5 options, A, B, C, D, E. Out of these 5 options, you're able to eliminate A and C because of grammar. The next thing that you're looking for is going to be meaning. And let's say D does not make any sense. Now the last thing that you look for is concision. So you choose the option that is more concise, that uses less number of words, that uses the active voice, and it has to be in the same order, grammar, and then meaning, and then concision. You do not reverse the order in any way. And that means that you often get options that look correct. You get multiple options that look correct. So it's usually down to these 2 criteria, that which is the correct option. And what we covered, the error that we covered in the last class was subject-verb agreement. So I'll be going through a recap of those rules right now. So any question till now? Or any doubt?
No, not for me.
No? Okay. All right, so I'm going to go through a recap of the subject-verb agreement errors. If you haven't watched the previous video, the previous class, and you don't have these rules written down somewhere, I suggest you should write these down. So these are a couple of general rules. So that means you can get more than one correct option. Again, this is reiterating the same point about meaning and concision. The second rule is working with splits. So these are usually at the beginning or at the ending of every option. So for example, you will have a few options that begin with will, and you have a few options that begin with would. So first of all, you need to make a choice there. Do you need to start with a will, or do you need to start with a would? Once you make that choice, you'll be able to eliminate a few options without reading all of them in detail. So that saves time, and that also gives you a very strong reason to eliminate an option, which is important. And the third point is eliminate options strongly. Don't eliminate just because it doesn't feel right, or when you speak it, it does not hear correctly. So you have to eliminate options because of some strong reason, either grammatical reason or meaning or concision. And fourth is write it down. Now this refers to the scratch paper. And the last important thing when you do, before you move on to the next question, is you need to ensure that the option, it fits well, it reads well with the non-underlined part of the sentence. So this is very important for the longer sentences. So you have a very long sentence and this is the option. Make sure that you read the entire sentence after putting in your answer. It should read completely. And that is one strategy through which you can eliminate a lot of wrong options as well, just because they don't fit well with the other part of the sentence. They may be correct, but they don't fit well. So this was something important that we covered regarding word choice, about concision, and what kind of words you need to choose. So I recommend you keep a list of these words. and keep adding to it, because as you do more and more sentences through your practice, you will come across more of these. A few simple differences. Lay versus lie. I think this one is easy. Lay would mean you lay something, you put something. Lie would be related to dishonesty. Similarly, you have aggravate, which is a verb form of irritating something. Aggravate the situation, worsen the situation. Aggravating is used more as an adjective, and that means, again, irritating, again, as an adjective. Known as would refer to the point where you're naming something. So, for example, New York is known as the Big Apple. Known to be is used for characteristics. For example, New York is known to be a big city. Similarly, loss of versus loss in. So loss of would be simply when you lose something, and loss in would represent a decrease in something. For example, loss in grades or loss in population. So that would be decrease. Native of versus native to would be that native of is used as a noun. For example, I am a native of this city. So when I talk about I am a native of this city, I am referring to myself as a noun. When I say I am native to this city, means I belong to this city. So that is more like a belonging that you're referring to. Another one is rate versus rates. So rate would just be, for example, the speed, the rate of decrease or the rate of increase, speed and acceleration. Rates would be related to the prices for anything. What is the rate for this particular object? Rise versus raise is easy, so I'm going to leave that one out. Try to do something versus try doing something. Try to do would be when there is an attempt to perform a task. Let me try to do this question. Try doing is carrying a little more experimental sense with it. Let me try doing this question. It's more like an experiment that I'm doing, not a real attempt, because it's tough to do. And then this is something very important. You will see it across many questions. You have a word that is being used in different forms across the options. For example, the word cutting. In a few options, it will be used as a noun. But in a few options, it will be used as a verb. How do they use this is they usually put off after these words. So if the sentence says the cutting off the leaves, now this is being used as a noun. But when you simply say cutting the leaves, now in this case, it becomes a verb. So it's very important to read each and every word of this option so that you don't miss the off. And this is a common mistake that students again do. They miss certain words, which is something you need to avoid. Will versus may versus would. Very, very, very important. We will be doing this when we cover the error of verbs, but I'm going to summarize this once more over here because it's very important. I think you will find at least one question in the real test that is going to test you on the difference between will and would. So I'm going to use an example here. So suppose right now I'm saying, so this is the year 2019, I am saying that I will do an MBA in 2020. So the statement is being said in the present and it talks about the future. So I am using will in this case. All right. But let's suppose I said something similar in 2009. In that case, I am speaking from the past into the future. In this case, I am going to use would. I'll say, so the sentence is going to be, I said I would do MBA in 2020. Let me put a year closer to that, in 2010. So this is where I use the would. So basically, if that statement is being said or written in the present, you use will. But if it's being mentioned from the past perspective, you have to use the would. Okay, is this difference clear to everyone?
Yes, for me.
Yes. All right. And do you need another example for this?
Yeah, I was about to ask. Actually, I wanted example for all of this, and so I hope I'll find it in the practice questions that you have posted.
Yeah,
So,
you're talking about like examples when you do the questions or examples of the differences?
uh, in fact, both. So, suppose we are talking about, we just talked about lay versus lie and aggravate versus aggravating. So, it would have been helpful if there was a sample question for this kind of statement. You know,
Okay.
yeah,
Well, these
that's
are
what I.
common word choices. And as we do more and more questions, we'll see more of these. So I think we'll come across all of these at some point.
Okay, so if you have planned to cover it, in that would be great, actually.
Okay. Let me just make a note of that. But I would say the most important ones that are more common are going to be this one, known as versus known to be. Usually the ones that have a word after them. And native of versus native to, it's too specific to a particular meaning, so it's not tested so much. This one is tested a lot. Try to do, try doing. Will, may, and would is tested very much. So you will see this again and again. And see, will and would are used when you are sure of something. May is used when there is a chance of something happening or not happening. So that is important. And must versus should is again not dependent on the grammar, but more on the meaning. So must is something that you ought to do. Again, you will find this word ought to at a lot of places. Should is something that is recommended. Usually someone else recommends that. So the government recommended something or the authorities recommended something. So that is when you use the should. But I'll try and give you a few examples for each one of them. And there's one extra point that I would like to add, which is if you get a choice between two verbs, one of them is simply using the to form, for example, to cut, and one of them is using the ing form, and there is no other difference in those two options, just these two different words, and both of them are verbs. Always prefer the to form as compared to the ing form. Right, this is something very important, and this is something that you will use in a lot of sentences too. So those are some of the word choices that you need to make and keep adding to this list. And this is also something very, very important. You will use this a lot. The first is do not end any kind of, so this is not a word, this is a sentence. Do not end sentences with prepositions. They may look correct to you, but those are going to be the wrong answers. So do not end any kind of sentence with words like in, from, at, to, between, though. And there are lots of other words like while or at, also, not also, although, all these words. So do not end any sentence with these words. The second is avoid starting sentences with being. So usually about 99.9% of the sentences that begin with this word are wrong. There can be exceptions where nothing else works and being is the only correct word to start a sentence. For example, let me use a current sentence. Being the firstborn son, he had to do something, something. So it's better if you use the word as in place of being. As the firstborn son, he had to do something, something, something. So as much as possible, avoid any option that starts with being. And the third is word placement. For example, the word only. So if I say, I eat breakfast at 9. So based on where you place the word only, you can get different meanings. For example, only I eat breakfast at 9, or I only eat breakfast at 9, or I eat only breakfast at 9, or I eat breakfast at only 9. So there can be different variations that you get. And how do you know what is the correct meaning? Basically, you have to use common sense in these GMAT and tense correction questions. You need to look at the meaning, understand the different times in which some events are happening, and then make sense of that whole phenomenon that is happening in front of you, and then see which word placement works well. So again, this is an error that we will see not so much, only some at some places, but this one is more common. All right, so this is a recap of the subject-verb agreement errors that we did. So this you will see in some of those questions that I shared last week. And I think both of you have access to those questions, right? The questions that I shared last week. Are you able to access that?
I'm able to.
Yeah. Okay. So the first basic rule is that the subject and verb both must exist. So sometimes you will have sentences where the subject is not really clear who is doing the action. So it should be very clear, and the verb, the verb usually exists in all of these sentences, so that shouldn't be a problem, but you need to focus more on the subject. The second is the subject and verb must agree with each other with respect to the gender. So sometimes the subject is a male and the verb is used for a female, so that's going to be wrong. What happens is sometimes you get a number of different subjects, and then it's confusing to see the verb talks about which of them. For example, A, along with B, was visiting. Let's put another noun here, C. So you have three people being talked about. In a short sentence, it's quite clear that we are definitely not using the was visiting for the C. But it's not so clear whether we're talking about A or we're talking about B. So there's a special rule about words like along with, which means that you always need to look at the noun which is before this particular phrase. So it does not matter whether B is singular or plural, male or female. This verb must agree with the subject at the beginning of the sentence. So I'm going to cover that rule over here. And the third important rule is you need to be careful of the extra clauses that are added to add length to the sentence. So for example, A, along with B, was visiting C. So right now I have just added a particular phrase, and it's easy to eliminate that and then read the remaining sentence so that you can figure out what is the subject, what is the verb, and whether they agree or not. Sometimes you have really long groups of words. For example, A, after he was fired because of something something that he did was visiting C. So in this case, you have a lot of words between the subject and the verb. So again, you need to practice enough. You need to read enough of these sentences and questions to realize that this is all extra. So this will probably not be in the underlined part of the sentence as well, because this is added just to confuse you. So you need to understand how these questions are made. Usually, they start with a very simple sentence. For example, A was visiting C. And now you can't get such a simple sentence in GMAT. So what you need to do is you need to complicate the sentence by adding stuff wherever you can. So probably something will be added here, something will be added here, probably an adverb will be added here, and something again will be added here. So these can be one word each. You can have multiple words, but you should be able to read and understand what is the basic sentence, the skeleton of the sentence behind it. This is something which is a very important skill in sentence correction, and we will observe this once we do these questions later in the class. The next important rule is and versus in addition to, along with, as well as, included, accompanied by, etc. So if you have something like A and B, and then you have the verbs here. Now it's quite clear that whenever you use and, it automatically becomes plural. So the verb that you use also has to be plural. For example, were or are, or any other plural verb. But when you have these other groups of words, in addition to, along with, as well as, including, accompanied by. So suppose you have A, and then you have as well as B, and then you have these verbs. Now in all of these cases, it does not matter what the second subject is, focus only on the first subject. So that's very important to identify whether you should use a singular verb or a plural verb. Okay, is this rule clear to all of you?
Yes, for me.
Yes. All right, and everyone else? Is everyone able to hear me? Priyanka? Let me just check. Priyanka, are you able to hear me?
Hello.
Okay, all right, fine. Yeah, I just wanted to know if you're able to hear me.
I can now.
Yeah, all right. So I'm just doing a recap of what we did last week, going through the rules in detail once.
Okay.
So this is the next rule. Whenever you have two subjects that are separated by these separators, for example, you have A or B is doing something. You have either A or B doing something, or you have neither A nor B doing something. In all of these three cases, look at the subject which is nearer to the verb, which is usually the second subject. So that should be the focus. So basically, this rule talks about the second subject. For and, it is always plural. And for the rest of these, you need to look at the first subject. So that's the basic rule for all of these different kinds of extra words that are given. The next rule is when you have either of, neither of, each of, or none of, it is always treated as singular. For example, either of you can join next week's class. Each of you can join next week's class. So right now I'm using join, which will work fine for all of the singular and plural subjects. But what if I say either of the students is coming to the class, or each of the students is coming, none of the students is coming, neither of the students is coming. So it does not matter whether I'm using extra words after or before, but if I'm using these groups, they automatically mean singular. So the verb also has to be singular. The next rule is something that's, again, that is very easy to identify in sentences. So whenever you have any combination of these words with these words, it is always treated as singular. Anyone is welcome. Everything is fine. Nothing is correct. Nobody is here. Someone is here. Somebody is here. So this thing is repeated twice. Instead of thing, you add one more extra word, which is place. Some place is good. No place is safe. Every place is the same. Any place is fine. So you make any combination of this group and the second group, you will always get a singular subject. And so you always have to use a singular verb. The next is each, every, each, and every. For example, each dog has its day. So it's going to be singular. Same goes for every dog has its day. And the same goes for each and every dog has its day. Again, these are all singular. Because when we use these words each, every, and each and every, we single out one particular component. And so it becomes singular. The next rule is collective nouns. For example, team, group, or class. They're almost always singular. So one distinction that I mentioned in the class last time was if the collective noun is doing something together as a group. For example, the team has won the championship. Now this is obviously being treated as singular because most of the times collective nouns are singular. But what if members of that group are doing different things? In that case, you treat it as plural, which is extremely rare, but it can happen. For example, the team have gone to their rooms. Now, you cannot say the team has gone to its room. It will not make sense because the team members all have different rooms. So in that case, you make an exception and you use them as plural. And the final rule for this particular slide is a number of versus the number of. When you say a number of people, it is always treated as plural. But when you say the number of people, it is always treated as singular. For example, a number of people are present here versus the number of people present here is very high. So the number of is always singular, a number of is always plural. So is everyone clear about this? If you have any questions, you can ask now. So I'm assuming everything.
Please tell me a little bit. I mean, I think I got confused. This either or of. Oh, sorry, this one. The either or, neither nor. Look for the nearest verb. So if you can just give me a sample.
Okay. All right. So for example, so you have one subject here, the child, and you have the other subject, which is parents. So this one is singular, this one is plural, and you have a verb here. So basically what I'm saying is that let's say the verb is placed here. So you need to match with the subject or the noun that is next to it, which in this case is going to be this one. So let's say I put or, the child or the parents are here. So it does not matter whether the child is singular or plural. You only have to focus on the parents, which is the subject next to the verb here. Even if I put something like either the child or the parents are here, the same rule applies. And if I convert them to neither the child nor the parents are here, again, the same rule applies. So you basically look at the verb and then you figure out which of these different subjects is next to the verb and you make the choice according to that subject. Okay, is it?
Yeah, it's clear. Thank you.
Okay. So I'll just do a very quick recap of what we did in critical reasoning. And remember, it's still a recap going on of the previous class. So what we did was we did not solve any questions. We basically just discussed what are the different parts of an argument. And I'm just going over through a recap of the previous class in detail this time because we're still at the beginning of the course. And it's very important to understand this recap so that we can move forward in the critical reasoning today. So the different parts of an argument are basically three, out of which the most important part is going to be the conclusion. Most of the times, it is very easy to figure out what is the conclusion because there will be words used like thus and therefore. In other cases, it's not so clear, but you can still make out what the author or the argument is trying to tell you. And whatever we do in CR, remember, whatever we do in CR is extremely important for the AWA section also. So in the CR questions, you'll get smaller arguments, but in the essay, you are going to get a bigger argument. So, but the same things apply over there as well, the same concepts. So there is one conclusion in every argument. And to support that conclusion, there is a lot of evidence that is given, which we will go through once again. So those pieces of evidences together are known as premises of that argument, and these two are clearly stated. The third thing that is the most important that you will be tested a lot on is the assumptions. And this is the focus of today's class. We are going to solve some assumption-based questions. So I'll talk about assumptions in detail when we start with CR. But you should know that these are the three important parts of an argument. Conclusion is mentioned, premises are mentioned, assumptions are not mentioned, but this is something that you need to understand. And these assumptions need to exist so that you are able to connect the premises to the conclusion. And we'll talk about this in detail later again. And then we also discussed about a few common patterns that you will usually see in these arguments. So the first common one is cause and effect. So the example that I used last time as well was that in an argument, let's say someone ate an ice cream and they got sick. So the usual conclusion is that the ice cream made that person fall sick. So that is a standard cause and effect kind of an argument, which is used very commonly. The second is planning. So this is usually used when the mayor of the city is talking about something or the university is deciding about something. So the plan is, for example, traffic has increased. So what we are going to do is we are going to run more buses. This is the kind of argument that you will see for plans. The third is sample. For example, some new rule is used. It works well in city A, which means that it will also work in the entire country. So basically, they use evidence from a sample of the population and they give you a conclusion about the whole population. So that is another common pattern that you are going to see in critical reasoning. And these patterns are something that we will revisit in the second part of the class. And this is something very important that we also discussed last time, the common wrong options that you see. At least 3 out of 5 options for critical reasoning are going to be of these categories, and these are the wrong ones. So any option that uses extreme language, words like will or never or always, or none, or must, any strong words, about 99.9% of the times, those options are wrong. Then there are some options that do the opposite of what you want. For example, the question is asking you, how do you strengthen this argument? But that particular option is weakening the argument. So that is, again, a very common wrong option. The third is out of scope. So let's say the argument is talking about a particular city, A, but one of your options is talking about a completely different city, B. So again, it does not make sense because it's out of scope. Or if a particular argument talks about a city and the option talks about a country, again, it's out of scope. So you need to be within a particular scope around the argument using the facts mentioned in the argument and then make a choice. You can't go and generalize it too much. And the fourth common wrong option that you will come across is an option that does nothing. It does not really matter whether that option is correct or not. Again, we'll be looking at examples of each of these common wrong options once we start doing the critical reasoning questions. So I'll revisit all of this once again. But let's try one little argument. So what I want you to do is just read this, take a minute, and tell me whether you see a plan here, or you see a sample here, or you see a cause and effect here. So that is the first thing that I want you to find out. And the second thing is, I want you to tell me what is the conclusion of this particular argument. So I'll give you a minute to figure that out. Okay, was everyone able to figure out at least which one of them is not being used? Do you think a sample is being used here? That we are talking about a subset of the population and using that to conclude something about the whole population?
No.
No? All right. So definitely there's not a sample that is being used here. Now, this is a kind of an argument where you have a mixture of two different, let's say, patterns here. So you have a bit of a plan here because the conclusion is talking about what should be done. And there's a bit of a cause and effect here as well, because if something is costly, you should not buy it. Or if something is, let's say, inexpensive, that is also going to work well. So you have a little bit of a cause and effect going on there as well. And I hope you were able to figure out the conclusion, because you have a word here, consequently, that clearly helps you identify what the conclusion is. Usually the conclusion is at the end of the sentence of the argument. Sometimes it's also in the beginning of the argument. Sometimes you have two different people debating on something, so you have one conclusion for each of the two people. So this one is quite clear. So this is what we did in the previous class, and let me go ahead. Okay, this is something that I also talked about in the last class. So this is what your scratch paper looks like. So when I was doing this argument, I talked about what were the premises. So remember, this is all in the order in which it appears in the argument. So I'm talking about practice instrument at home, being used to learn, but it's costly, worth only if there is talent, which we know later, and therefore buy second hand first, cheap one first. And that is the conclusion. So in this case, the assumption is basically that whatever kind of piano that you buy, it makes no difference in the skill level or the talent of the child. So this is what the scratch paper should look like.
I have a question here.
Yes.
In the cause-effect relationship that you spoke about, does the cause always have to come from one of the premises and the effect always have to be in the conclusion? I'm sorry if I'm asking something which you already answered previously because I was not a part of the of your last class.
Okay. So what usually happens is in the premises, they talk about an event that is happening. And in the conclusion, they say that that particular event caused the event in the conclusion. Sometimes it's very clear that this event in the premises happened before the event in the conclusion. So this is the cause and this is the effect. Sometimes it's not so clear. So when it's not clear, usually you will be asked to weaken that particular argument. And that is where you have to exploit the fact that it's not very clear. So it, like, for example, it could have been the reverse as well. Maybe this event could have caused the first event, right? So sometimes it's not clear, sometimes it's very clear. But usually if the conclusion is saying that you should do this, they usually give you a reason why you should do this, and that reason is the cause. Is that clear?
Yes, thanks a lot.
Okay. So this is basically our agenda for this class. We are going to cover pronouns in sentence correction, and we are going to cover questions on assumptions in critical reasoning. Now, one point that I failed to mention here is that out of the 100% of CR questions, about 50, not about 50, yeah, I would say about 50 of these are based on assumptions and how do you weaken a particular argument. And about an extra 20% may be based on how do you strengthen an argument. So these three kinds of questions, assumption questions, strengthen questions, and weaken, these are the ones that you will see more often than not, and they have to be your strong area. And to understand how to solve these questions, you basically need to understand that same basic relationship, that there are premises, there are conclusions, and connecting both of these are a set of assumptions. So in assumption questions, you basically identify what these assumptions are. In weaken questions, you basically attack these assumptions and show that they don't exist, or you do the opposite of what the assumption is saying. And in strengthen questions, you basically enhance these assumptions. You give examples of how those assumptions work. So this basic relationship is very, very important, very critical to understand in all critical reasoning arguments, because this is the basis of what these questions are all about. And the remaining about 30% of the questions are about how do you resolve paradoxes, or how do you evaluate an argument, how do you complete an argument that is incomplete. So those kinds of questions. And in today's class, we are going to focus on assumption questions, because that is the first step. You need to identify what the assumption is. Only then you can move to the next weaken and strengthen question types. So let's begin with sentence correction first. So we still have about an hour to go, and we'll be covering sentence correction in that hour, and then we will be covering critical reasoning in the next hour. And at the end of the class, I'll be giving you questions for critical reasoning. I've already given you questions in sentence correction. It should be there on the course curriculum. So there's a separate file which has all sentence correction questions divided error-wise. So you just need to identify where the pronoun questions are and solve them. And I'll be also uploading a second file only on pronoun questions. So let's begin with what are pronouns. So pronouns are basically used in place of nouns. There are a few important parts of speech. So there are nouns, there are pronouns, and you have some other parts of speech, for example, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions, and interjections. So the other ones are not so important for us right now. So let's just focus on these two, nouns and pronouns. So pronouns, I'm sure everyone understands pronouns. What are pronouns? For example, he, she, it, they, those are pronouns. And because I'll be using some of this terminology in solving the questions, so I'll go through these ones also. So the first person, let me talk about singular, plural, and let me talk about a third one as well, which is possessive pronouns. So first person would be when you're talking about yourself. So singular pronouns are simple ones. I do something, or something is done to me. So that would be a singular first person pronoun. Plural first person pronoun would be we do something, or something is done to us. All right, so we have we and us. Possessive would be, for example, this is our home, or this home is ours. So those are the two possessive forms. Or this is my home, or you can say this home is mine. So those are the first person possessive pronouns. Okay, and let me know if you need more examples for each one of them. I'm just assuming that these are some of the basic ones, so there shouldn't be much confusion. Usually the confusion is usually in the possessive cases of these pronouns. Then comes the second person, the person you're talking to. Usually you use pronouns like you. You are doing something, or something is being done to you. Even if that person is singular or plural, it's the same pronoun that is being used for singular and plural both. You do something, or something is being done to you. For possessive, you can say this is your book, regardless of whether that person is singular or plural. Or you can say this book is yours, regardless of whether that person is singular or plural. So that is the second person. Third person is, so the first person and the second person are engaged in a conversation about the third person. So in this, you have different kinds of genders as well. For example, he is doing something, she is doing something. Something is being done to him, something is being done to her. So those are the singular ones. Then the plural ones. They are doing something versus something is being done to them. So you have the active and you have the passive as well. Possessive would be again easy. This belongs to him. So this is his book and this book belongs to him. Or for example, this is her book. This book belongs to her and this book is hers. So you have these different variations in case of singular people. In case of plural, you will have pronouns like this is their book or this is theirs. So those are the differences in this case. I think him is not going to come here. That was a mistake. So it's just his, her, hers, their, and theirs. So is everyone clear about these pronouns? Any doubt in any of these? Just go through them once and see if you have any confusion. If not, should we move ahead?
Yeah, all good for me.
All right. All right, so let's move ahead. So these are the few basic pronouns. You need to be very clear where they're being used. And I think the singular and plural are fine. So let's begin with the first very, very, very important rule of pronouns. And this is the rule that is often violated in the wrong options, which is the antecedent must exist. You need to mention that you are using a pronoun, but that pronoun is being used for what? So basically this rule says that you can't simply have a sentence that uses the pronoun he, or him, or his, without ever telling what is the name of this person. So that noun for which you are using that pronoun must exist. So that is the first rule. And because sentences beginning or having he and him and his are fine, grammatically they're correct, but they don't give you a sense of the meaning. So you need to have either the name or the person or some kind of reference to who that person is before you use the pronoun. And this does not mean that the pronoun needs to always come after the noun. It can be different. Most of the times, the noun usually comes before the pronoun. For example, Sam was in his office. Now, this is a very basic sentence, but it gives you an idea of what I'm saying. So the noun is here, the pronoun is here, so the noun clearly comes before the pronoun, which is the usual case. Sometimes it's the opposite. So for example, because he was in his office, Sam couldn't answer my phone or answer my call. So in this case, the pronoun he and the pronoun his are coming before, but you still have a noun in place of which you are using those pronouns. Now, this noun in place of which you use the pronoun is called an antecedent. Now, ante means before, but before is not with respect to its position in the sentence. Before is with respect to the meaning. So antecedent is basically the noun in place of which you are using that particular pronoun. And it must exist. So that's the first rule. The second rule is that the pronoun must agree with the antecedent with respect to the gender, the number, and the meaning. So let me take a basic example of Sam again. So you have Sam here. So let's take Samuel. Now you have to make a few assumptions in sentence correction. So you have to assume that Samuel is the name of a man or a male. So whatever pronouns you use, you cannot use her for Samuel because it does not match the gender. You cannot use they for Samuel because it does not match the meaning or the number. You cannot use it for Samuel because it does not match the meaning. So it is, so let me just add it over here. It is usually used for institutions like the government or a city or a group of people. It can be used for collective nouns like classes and teams. And it is used for animals. So basically birds, insects, or all other kinds of animals. And it can also be used for places, but usually places you can avoid because places don't really do actions. And you usually use pronouns for the nouns that are doing action. So this one is going to be a little rare. But yeah, the second rule is pronoun must agree with the antecedent. The third rule, you need to be extra careful about it. It is, so this refers to it is, they, them, and their. So this is very, very, very important rule. Again, these three are equally important rules. But this one, it's much more easier to identify, but it's something that students usually skip because these words are so small and they get lost in all the other big words that are around them. Whenever you see any of these words in the underlined part of the sentence, you need to be very careful, and there's a very huge chance that these pronouns are being tested, because these are the pronouns which lead to errors most of the times, especially it, they, and them. These three are really dangerous pronouns, and whenever you see them in the underlined part of the sentence, most probably they are being tested. So the first thing that you need to check whenever you get these pronouns is whether you have an antecedent for each one of them or not. And the second thing, whether that particular antecedent is agreeing with them or not. So very, very, very important. And remember the difference between its and its. So its is the pronoun form. For example, give the dog its bone. So this is used for possession. But when you use it is, the dog is, let's say, using or chewing, let me use another word. It is a beautiful day. Basically, this is a short version of it is, and that's the basic difference between the it's without the apostrophe and the it's with the apostrophe. This is a very, I would say, a common sense difference. Most of you would know this, but the problem is it's a very small word. And this apostrophe is very easy to miss when you have really long sentences. So that's why I'm repeating this rule once again. Whenever you find these pronouns, you need to make sure that they have an antecedent, and that antecedent must agree with the pronoun which is being used. Very, very important pronouns. The next important rule is on demonstrative pronouns. So you need to be a little aware of these meanings, although they represent a bit of a vague term because they are used in place of nouns. You're not exactly sure on what these are representing, but you need to be clear that this and that are used for singular antecedents or singular nouns. These and those will be used for plural nouns. And this is usually used for nouns that are much more nearer. That is used for the ones that are far. Similarly, these are used for the ones that are nearer, and those are used for the ones that are far. Again, this is something that you probably knew, but again, it's quite easy to miss these differences, especially if you have long options and a few of these options are using this, a few of these options are using that. It can be quite possible to miss that there is a difference between them. And most of these rules, they look easy here, but they are much tougher when they're used in a sentence. The fifth one, the pronouns must not be ambiguous or vague. So I told you repeatedly that the first three rules are important. This is the next important rule. Pronouns must not be ambiguous or vague. For example, Sam, let me be clear about the gender. Samuel met his father and talked about his project. Now, in this case, you have two pronouns. One is his, the other is also his. Now, this his is quite clear. You're talking about the father of Samuel. So, his is referring to Samuel. But the second one, the second his, now, according to the meaning, this project can belong to Samuel as well as Samuel's father. So this his can technically work for Samuel and father both. So that means it's very ambiguous or vague. That means the sentence is wrong. So you need to either mention about Samuel's project or about his father's project again. So any kind of pronoun that is not very clearly identifying which noun it refers to, again, it's going to be wrong. And this is, again, one of the most common errors that you're going to find for pronouns. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and ask you if you have any doubt in these rules, these 5 very important rules. If you need any example. Anyone?
Are we going to do the samples for this?
Yeah, we'll be doing a few questions on these after we're done with the rules.
Yeah, I understood.
Yeah, but I hope all of you are writing these down somewhere, because we'll be using these again and again. And you will need to refer to these when you do the questions on your own at home as well. Okay, so let me move ahead. All right, so here we have our first question. Let's do this one together. So I'm going to do this in detail, so it's going to take more than the time it should take. So probably you should be able to do this question in 1.5 minutes in the real test, but we are going to take this slowly. So the first step is you read the sentence in detail. Scientists have identified an asteroid, this one, that is about 1/2 mile wide, and if it strikes Earth. So you know that you have a pronoun here, it. It can do tremendous damage to part of the planet, but probably not cause planet-wide destruction. So since it is present, it is most probably a pronoun question. So now let's look at option A. Now option A is going to be similar to option, the original sentence. Now, when you read this sentence quickly, scientists have identified an asteroid that is about 1/2 mile wide, and if it strikes Earth, it can do tremendous damage to part of the planet, but probably not cause planet-wide destruction. So does anyone have any kind of issue with this part of the sentence, with option A? Right now we're just at option A. Any one of you feel that it is wrong, maybe because of the it, or because it does not read well?
It's not ambiguous, I don't think, but it could be, it could read more well. I think it could, yeah, it could sound better, but I'm not sure. Since I haven't read the other options, I don't know.
All right, definitely it can sound better. So what is being used here is, since this is something that I told in the last class, that Usually you will not get questions that test only one error. That's very rare. Even at the easiest levels of sentence correction, you will have a couple of errors. So in this one, there's an error that is being used, which we still haven't covered, which is parallelism, but I'll still go through what that means. So when you read this sentence, what should be a better version is, if it strikes the earth, it can do something, something, but it probably will not cause planet-wide destruction, right? So basically what is happening is, either you use it here as well, between but and probably, or you eliminate the it which is present here, the second one. So you can say, if it strikes Earth, can do tremendous damage to part of the planet, but probably not cause planet-wide destruction. Or if it strikes Earth, it can do tremendous damage to part of the planet, but it probably will not cause planet-wide destruction. So there's a mismatch that is happening there. And it's not a pronoun error, but option A is eliminated because of parallelism. So I'm just going to draw two parallel lines here to tell what's the reason why A is eliminated. Now let's move to B. And notice that B is using something that we've already discussed. So this, I am going to leave it to you. So take time as much as you want, and then tell me, do you think would is correctly placed here or not? Refer back to where you mentioned something about will versus would and see if it applies here or not.
I think it makes sense because it's some conditional future.
Okay. And okay, if that makes sense, what about this it? Do you find any problem with this word?
Yeah, because it could refer to Earth or the asteroid.
Yeah, that is completely correct. So I hope the other students, were you able to identify this problem with B? That if you look at it, it can actually refer to Earth as well. I mean, grammatically, it makes sense. Meaning-wise, maybe it doesn't. But grammatically, the sentence would be correct. Right? Do you agree? Did you understand?
Yes, I did.
Yes? All right. So that is one more problem with B. And let's remove B because of the it. And also, once we do all the options, you'll realize B is just too wordy. It does not need to have so many words. All right, C. Now, C and D both use would, but I want you to make a choice between C and D. If you had to keep an option, which one would you keep and why? And before you make a choice, let me just recap something that was covered in the previous class about were. Now you see here, it is used and were is being used. It is singular, were is plural. Normally they wouldn't make any sense, but in hypothetical situations, so that is an extra rule. In hypothetical fake situations, you can use were for plural, for singular subjects also. For example, if I were a president, I would do something. All right, so that's a hypothetical situation. So you need to check whether that applies here or not, and then make a choice. Okay, go ahead.
I think to me C is better.
C is better. Okay, what's the problem with D?
The if Earth is struck by it, it's, I guess that's passive, or it's not sounding as good if it as the other one if it were to strike Earth.
Okay. Any other reason?
It's not logical.
Okay, which part of it does not seem logical, or what do you think is the wrong logic?
If Earth is stuck by it.
Okay, so this is something that we usually avoid. This is the passive voice. And that if you have a choice between active and passive, always go for the active. So this is wrong. One more thing is you usually do damage to something. So in this part, the to is missing, which is present here. So these two are some of the errors. The would is completely fine. It's correctly placed because we're talking about a situation that hasn't happened. But if it were to happen, then what would happen? Right, so were is completely fine. D is definitely wrong because of the passive voice and because of the to. Okay, what about option E now?
Noun error, I think.
Yes. Again, it's the same problem with it could experience a tremendous amount of damage. Now, if it strikes Earth, it could. Over here, it was looking like this to me that this is talking about the asteroid. But as I read the remaining part, it looks like it's talking about the Earth. So it's not very clear, and it's an ambiguous pronoun error. So E is also eliminated, and C is the answer. Okay, so you see there were so many reasons why you could eliminate these 4 options. So there are definitely more than 4 reasons why you were able to eliminate them, and they all use different kinds of errors. Some of them are pronouns. There's a little bit of subject verb agreement as well. So before you eliminate an option, you need to have a strong reason why you're eliminating it. So this is something that you need to do on your scratch paper. So you don't need to go into more detail. You don't need to have a neat handwriting, but you do need to put down reasons why those options are wrong. What usually happens is when you take a practice test and you look at this scratch paper work, after you have reviewed your answers, you will realize that you made some really bad mistakes here because you eliminated the correct options because of some error that did not exist, and you chose the wrong options because you failed to recognize an error. So that's why the review is very important, and the scratch paper work also. So any doubt in any of these options for this question? Anyone?
I just have, I wanted to have some doubt. Maybe it's too trivial, but if it were, can you just explain it once again?
Okay. So usually, so I'm going to erase, let me erase some of it. All right, so what I was saying is that usually when you have a singular noun, for example, myself, or let's say the president, that is a singular noun, and you need a singular verb with that. But if it's a fake situation, in that case, you can use a plural verb for that. For example, if the president were to do something, he would suffer the results. But this is a fake situation that is happening. Even though the president is singular, we are using were for that president. And let me take an easier case, something that you may relate more to. So, for example, if I say, if she were my friend, she would have stood up for me. Right? I think this sentence is much more easier to understand, right? Or if he were my friend, he would have done the same. If he were in my place, he would have done the same. Right? Are you getting the hypothetical nature of these sentences? Did you understand? Or should I give some more examples?
Yeah, I got it. Yeah.
All right. So you have to look at the meaning. You have to look at the meaning that it's not happening. It is not striking the earth right now. But what if it happened? So you're assuming a hypothetical situation. And in that case, were is completely fine. And that's why we're using words like could and would again. So that is option C. Let's try one more question. Okay, this is the same question, but this is just showing the scratch paper work, which I showed already. So this is how it should look like. And instead of question numbers, you can even write like a code word so that you will know what question you're referring to. All right, so let's do this question together again. So it says, today's semiconductor innovations allow chip makers to design silicon wafer chips more space efficient now than at any time since their inception. So as soon as you read it, you know that there's a pronoun there. So what I want you to do is, again, look at option A and see if it makes sense or not. Just option A.
I think there is an error there.
So you think there is completely fine? Check for all things. Check if there's an antecedent, if it agrees with the antecedent, if it's very clear, or do you think it's ambiguous? Check for all those 3-4 things.
It looks like there it's not correctly referring to silicon wafer chips or the chip makers.
Yes. And it can also refer to innovations. So you have 3 candidates which can act as nouns for the word there. So definitely A is gone because of the ambiguous pronouns. Okay. So now take about a couple of minutes and go through all of these options, B, C, D, and E. And also notice the splits. You have a few options ending with there, and you have a few options that don't end with there. And then make a choice. Okay. So anyone has an answer? What are your answers?
B according to it's B according to me.
Okay. Now, anyone else has a different answer? Okay, one little strategy or one little recommendation for these sentence correction questions is once you realize that one word or one little concept is creating an error in that particular option, for example, there for option A, you quickly see through all options to check if there's any other option that repeats the same error. And if you look at it, B and D have the same error because they end with there. And if there is ambiguous in the first option, it will be equally ambiguous in B and D. So that means even without reading B and D in the real test, you should be able to eliminate both of them. So A, B, and D are all gone because of ambiguity. Now look at C and D. C and E. So those are the only two options. And there's one more extra rule that is being followed here, but sometimes it's not followed, which is when you have a more in the sentence, you must have a than in the sentence if it's being used for comparison. And in both of them, you are having them, so that's correct, but that's just an extra rule that is useful to know. So now let's come down to C and E. So basically it says, today's innovations allow the makers to design silicon chips that are more space efficient than those at any other time. Now, can you notice a difference here between any other time versus any time? Which one do you think is correct? Is it C or E?
E.
E. Okay, so let me give you a separate example to highlight the differences between both of them. One is I am taller than any girl in my class versus I am taller than any other girl in my class. Which one do you think is giving you the correct meaning?
B.
It's B, because if you talk about A, you yourself are included in that, any girl in my class. And it won't make sense that you're saying I'm taller than myself. So you need to mention this word other to mention that you are excluding yourself out of that group. So I'm taller than any other girl in my class. Let me take another example. January is colder than any month versus January is colder than any other month. Now, other month is making more sense because you're excluding January and you're talking about the other 11 months. So the same rule applies here. So that is why you need to eliminate option E as well, because when you say anytime, that includes right now as well. And we are talking about now versus any other time. Okay, so here we are using now, but here we are using are, which also means now. So that is why C is the correct answer. So was everyone able to understand the error in E?
I did.
Okay, and everyone else did?
Yeah.
Right, all right. So C is going to be the answer for this. So again, as you see, there is one proper error in every option that you eliminate, one strong error. And you have to use this in the real test and when you do your practice as well. So let's try this one together, but with a little more speed. Again, a pronoun error. A known cause for the failure of barley crops is poor aeration of the soil, and in particular, the seedlings root zone. But since the introduction of new strains, which are more resistant to water logging, barley has survived better after seasonal floods. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, I'm going to let you try this question. I've read it once. You can't really see any pronoun. Let me check. Yes, there's not a proper pronoun that is being used in option A, but see if there are pronouns, and definitely a pronoun error will be used somewhere. So go through this question on your own once. I think this is barley.
Like, but since the introduction of new strains, there is a problem there, I think.
Okay. With
Looks
respect
like
to meaning?
but barley is, but since the introduction of new strains of barley, I think that pronoun or that, that word may be required there, that noun.
Okay. And go ahead.
Yeah, that's it. I'm not sure.
Okay. I also want all of you to look at the first part of every option till here. I think you'll be able to eliminate a few options based on these first few parts. See which one makes more sense using less number of words.
I think E.
Aeration of the soil. But don't you think E is changing the meaning? Because it says introduction of this and this. So they're not really introducing this root zone.
Right.
Right? So it's not grammatically wrong, but definitely there's an error in the meaning here. So it's wrong with the meaning. Okay, if you had to make a choice between soil aeration and between aeration of the soil and the zone, which one do you think is better? It's either AC or it's BD.
I think it would be AC.
Yes, because if you say soil aeration, particularly the seedlings root zone, See, over here, the basic noun is aeration. And here, the basic noun is zone, the zone in that soil. And they don't really match with each other with respect to the meaning. Same goes over here, soil, aeration, and that of. Now, this pronoun that of, that refers to what? What of the seedling's root zone? Meaning wise, it should be aeration of the seedling's root zone. But over here, we just have soil aeration, not aeration of the soil. That is why D is gone. Again, there's a little bit of a pronoun error here. And same goes for A. No, sorry, not A, B. Yeah. So B is gone, D is gone. Now make a choice between A and C.
I think A looks more concise.
Okay, but remember this order again, grammar and then meaning and then concision. So the difference, the remaining part of the sentence is absolutely same. It's only the first part, which is different in A and C. Now see in A, there's a little bit of confusion with respect to the meaning. It says aeration of the soil and the seedling's root zone. They should have added another of here if they wanted to make the sense that we're talking also about aeration of the seedling's root zone. Because otherwise it is a bit of a confusion because it does not go well with the other part of the sentence. It could also mean that the known cause for failure of barley crops is poor aeration of the soil, and another cause is the seedling's root zone. Okay, did you all understand why A is not making sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, did everyone else understand it? Because the meaning wise, the cause, there is only one cause for the failure of the crops, which is poor aeration. And poor aeration is of two parts, generally soil and particularly the root zone. That's the meaning. But what option A it looks like is we're talking about two different causes. One is aeration of the soil and the other is the seedling's root zone. That is why option A is not giving you the correct meaning. So it's wrong because of the meaning. Did everyone else get this? Any problem in option A versus C? And if you have any doubt, please ask me because these are like some of the basics of pronouns and you need to understand them in detail. Because later more and more errors will be crammed into the same question. And if you look at the pronoun, that, it also refers to aeration, so that makes sense. All right, so let's move ahead. Okay, this is a question that I'm going to give you 2 minutes for, and then we will discuss it together. So you have 2 minutes for this question. Eliminate as many options as you can. Okay, you have about half a minute left. All right, let's go through the sentence now. So I'm going to read the sentence first. Because a manufacturer secures a patent for a compound, the patent does not bar competitors from producing a chemical like it, as long as those chemicals have at least one structural difference with the patented compound. So definitely there is a pronoun, it. Let me just highlight all the pronouns in this particular sentence. So you have its hair, its hair. Okay. All right, so did anyone get A as the answer, as the correct option? I hope not, because this word it here, the pronoun it, is ambiguous. So I hope you were able to figure this one out, because it can refer to patent, it can refer to the compound as well. So that's why A is gone. In option B, that a manufacturer has secured. Usually you do not begin with that. That's not a very strict rule, but that's just not proper word choice. But we'll still read the remaining sentence. That a manufacturer has secured a patent for one of its compounds. Even if you're using that, this should have been a does. So basically that is equal to the fact that. The fact that a manufacturer has secured a patent for one of its pharmaceutical compounds does not bar competitors from doing something. So B is also eliminated because of this that and because of the do. Option C, a patent for one of a manufacturer's pharmaceutical compounds does not, just correct, bar competitors from producing a chemical like the patented compound, as long as the two differ structurally in at least one way. This seems fine. Now, there is one difference between C and DE, which is the difference between like and such as. This is something that we'll do once we cover the errors related to comparisons, but I'll still summarize what the difference is. So basically, like is used whenever we make comparisons. We are comparing two things. Such as is used whenever you want to give examples. So, for example, my company has many patents, such as a patent for this and a patent for that. Okay, so just let me know if you're clear till now, and I think you've figured out that the answer is going to be C in this case, because such as is just not correct in D and E. So just let me know if you were able to get the correct answer, and if not, if you have any kinds of doubts in any option. Anyone got a different answer? Anyone? Lakshmi, Priyanka?
I got C, so I think.
Okay.
Yeah, so more or less that like and such as is a new thing right now. So anyway, you'll cover it later.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, this is usually a problem when you start doing all of these sentence correction questions one by one. But eventually we'll see subject-verb agreement also being tested in some of the later errors. So yeah, you'll have to look at these rules separately. So
But what
let's.
I'm understanding is like I think, uh, I mean, as we go, as we progress, we would be able to eliminate it with more rules that you would be teaching us.
Yes,
So,
that's true.
so that would become faster, maybe. Yeah, that's what I
Yes.
think.
Yeah, because in every sentence right now, you're learning something new that you did not know before. So that will change. Yeah. Okay, let us try one more. Uh, wait, let me go to another question. Okay, let's try this one. You have 2 minutes for this. And I'll give you a few hints as well. I'll just write them down here. Okay, so what are your answers?
D.
D? Did you say D?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else has a different answer?
So D.
Okay. All right, so let's look at the first hint that I gave here. Look at the concision. So this is basically, these both hints refer to the difference between these parts versus these parts. So you can see C, D, and E are definitely more concise and they give you the same meaning. A, you can simply just say at least twice. There's no need to say twice or more than twice. And B is anyways complicating it unnecessarily. So A and B are gone because they are just simply wordy. And C and E are using these pronouns, this being and it being, which looks like it refers to the drug, the current standard drug. But actually what we're trying to do is we're talking about the latest treatment, which is in the beginning of the sentence. So the words this and it, they don't really make sense here. They don't make the meaning sense here. Grammatically, they may be correct. So C and E are ruled out and D is the answer. Okay, so that was very good that you were able to get that answer. Let's try a couple of more questions before we head to CR. And if you have any doubts, you can always ask me in the middle. Okay, let's try this question. So you have 2 minutes again. Okay, let's go through these options one by one. So option A is using something which is used in a lot of wrong sentences. Option A is using the pronoun it to talk about an entire action, which is wrong. So this is again something that we haven't covered so far, but these pronouns it and this, Now, we haven't covered so far because it's quite in the definition of the word pronoun that pronouns replace nouns, but sometimes in wrong options, these pronouns are used to replace actions, which is not correct. So when you say it was done by, meticulously typesetting this and this, so this whole is an action, not a noun, and you cannot use it to refer to an action. So A is gone. Now let's come to option B. Manuscripts had to be meticulously typeset letter by letter before the development of digital typesetting, which allows typographers to do something. So this seems fine. Let's keep this one right now. C. Typographers had to meticulously typeset letter by letter before they developed digital typesetting. We're talking about typographers in the past, and we're not really sure whether they are the ones who developed this digital typesetting or not. Even if they did, we do not have any proof in the sentence that they are the ones who developed that. So C is gone. D, before developing digital typesetting, manuscripts were. Now, this does not make sense. It's an error that we haven't done yet. It's a modifier error. So basically it says, before developing digital typesetting, what should come here is the name of that person or the people who actually developed digital typesetting. Maybe it could have read that before developing digital typesetting, innovators had tried to do something else. So D is wrong. Again, this is an error that we haven't covered so far. It's a modifier error. And C was wrong because of the pronoun they. A was wrong because of the pronoun it. And E, before the developing of. Now, if you have a choice between developing and development, remember I told you always choose the noun form, the to form or the noun form. And developing is the ing form. It's unnecessarily complicating matters. We don't need it. So that's wrong. Before the developing of digital typesetting, manuscripts had to be meticulously typeset letter by letter. And this is again using the passive voice. We don't need to use so many words, and that is why option E is wrong and B is correct. So I hope most of you got B. If you have any doubt, you can ask me now. If you got some other answer or anything, just let me know.
All good.
All good? Okay. So that was good if you were able to get to B. And then the last sentence correction question for today is this one. It's a short one and an easy one, so I'll give you 1 minute. Okay, another 15 seconds left. Okay, let's look at the options. So I hope you were able to eliminate B and C, because they are just repetitive, using and, using then. D and E are wordy, so they're eliminated, and A makes complete sense. And it is necessary to san it. Now, it obviously refers to surface. It does not refer to paint because paint is being used as a verb here, and surface, rough surface, is the only noun being used, apart from the primer and the paint, which are being referred to again. But yeah, so A is correct. I hope you were able to get this. If not, if you can ask me if you have any doubts or anything in general about sentence correction before we move on to critical reasoning. Any questions that you have?
All good for me.
Okay, so at the end of the class, I'll be giving you an extra file that will contain questions on pronouns. And from the last class, you already have the file which have like sentence correction questions of all different errors, grouped error-wise, topic-wise. And then for critical reasoning also, I'll be adding a file that will have critical reasoning questions on assumptions. So let's get started with assumption-based questions. And this is just how my scratch paperwork looked like when I was solving these questions. And this is something that you can use as a template to solve the different questions. So it just helps you keep track of which options you have eliminated and the reason why you've eliminated those options. Okay, so let's begin with assumptions. Before that, let's look at this pattern because it's a common pattern. So we'll also look at assumptions with these patterns. So cause and effect. Let me take an example. So I think this is an example that I in the last class as well. So let's say in the month of June, in a particular beach city, it has been observed that every year in the month of June in that beach city, ice cream sales increase and at the same time, concurrently, simultaneously, non-violent crime, not violent, let me say violent crime also increases. So therefore, the conclusion is that the ice cream has something in it that leads people to do violence. Now, it's pretty clear that this is the conclusion and this is the premise. Now, I think Priyanka is the one who attended the previous session live, and a few others might have watched the previous class's video. So let me ask you this question. What do you think are a few assumptions in this kind of cause and effect relationship? And I covered that in the last class as well. Do you remember? Okay, let me put these down. So remember, whenever there is a cause and effect relationship, for example, the ice cream causing the violence, there are three assumptions. So if you get an argument like that, and then you get a question, which of the following is an assumption? You look for these three. One of them will definitely be there, and that will be the answer. The first is that there is no other reason for that effect. So basically, the assumption is that there's nothing else that is causing the violence. It is only the ice cream. There's no other factor that can explain that effect of violence. So that's the first assumption. The second assumption is that it's not a coincidence But this particular argument has already figured that out by mentioning that this happens in every June. So that's an assumption that it's not just a coincidence, it happens every time. And the third one, which is applicable whenever the cause and effect are happening at the same time. The third assumption is that the reverse is not true. That means it's not that people are violent, and because of that violence, ice cream sales have increased. So the reverse is not true. These are the three assumptions. Is everyone clear on this?
Yeah.
Right, all right. And this applies to the AWA arguments as well. And cause and effect is one of the most direct and straightforward patterns that you can have. Just remember these three are the assumptions. First is there's no other reason for that effect. Second is it's not just a coincidence. Third is reverse is not true. And along with these, also remember I talked about in the recap about some of the common wrong CR options. So remember any option that uses extreme language, words like will, never, always, forever, or none, any extreme language, those options are usually wrong. Then options that do nothing, basically that do not matter, are again wrong. Options that do the opposite of what you want them to do are obviously wrong, but these are a little hard to recognize at first. They get confusing. And then options that completely change the scope, that are out of scope, are the ones that are wrong. So the first step before we move to the question is you read the argument, you predict what the answer should be like, and then you move to the options. So let's have a look at a question here. And let's do this question together. So this question stem is an assumption question stem, but it's acting it in a more twisted way. The vicious cycle described above could not result unless which of the following were true. So basically it's asking us what is the assumption. Let's look at the pattern over here. When people evade income taxes, so let me write that down here, make a few notes. People evade income taxes by not declaring, so by non-declaration of the taxable income, a vicious cycle results. Tax evasion forces lawmakers to raise the tax rates. So the tax rates increase, which causes the burden on the paying taxpayers to become heavier. This in turn encourages even more taxpayers to evade taxes by hiding their income. So this is the cycle. People evade taxes by not declaring their income. Because of that, the tax rates need to be increased. Because of that, the burden increases on the paying taxpayers. Because of that, more and more people evade those taxes. So this is a cause and effect relationship where three actions are happening one after the other, according to that argument. So remember the three assumptions. The first is that there is no other reason. The second is that it's not a coincidence. And the third is that the reverse is not true. So let's look at option A, an increase in tax rates. So we're talking about this second level over here, functions as an incentive for taxpayers to try to increase their pre-tax incomes. Now, do you think this option is matching these assumptions? Be very critical of every word that you see in this option. It says incentive for taxpayers to try to increase their pre-tax incomes. Are we even talking about increasing the income anywhere, pre-tax or post-tax? We are not. So option A is eliminated because it is out of scope. We are not talking about pre-tax incomes. Although if you look at A, outside this argument, it would make sense, but within this argument, within the boundary and within the scope, it's not making sense. So A is eliminated. Let's look at B. Some methods for detecting tax evaders. Now we're talking about methods, and thus recovering some tax revenue lost through evasion. We're talking about recovering here. Bring in more than they cost, but their success rate varies from year to year. Again, option B is talking about methods and about recovering the revenue that was already lost. And that is why it is again out of scope, and B is again eliminated. And it also does not match any of our assumptions. Now what I want you to do is, I've eliminated two options. I want you to go through C, D, and E. I'll give you a couple of minutes. I want you to look at the assumptions that we have here at the top, the three assumptions, and then make a choice. So your 2 minutes start now. Okay, about half a minute left. Okay, so tell me, what did you choose as the answer?
I'm not sure. I choose B.
Okay, any other answer? Anyone else has chosen? Priyanka, what about you? What did you choose?
I chose D as well.
Okay, D. All right, let's begin with E. It says taxpayers do not differ from each other with respect to taxation that will cause them to taxes. So basically it means that everyone gets the same rate of tax applied. But that does not do anything. It's not an assumption. Even if it were not true, it wouldn't really harm the argument. So E is gone. It does not do anything. C and D. Okay, so you both have chosen D. No one who routinely hides some taxable income, so we're talking about these evaders, can be induced by a lowering of tax rates to stop hiding such income unless fines for evaders are raised at the same time. Now, two things to notice here. This is also talking about some kind of a method, plus it is using an extreme word. So that extreme word should be enough to let you know that D is not going to be an answer. See, again, this is something that you already knew, that extreme options are wrong. But sometimes you're not easily able to recognize that this is an extreme option. This basically says that there's not even one person who can be induced by lowering of taxes unless the fines are raised at the same time. There's always a possibility that there's one person like that. So that is why D is wrong and C is the answer. So let's look at C. When lawmakers establish the rates to generate a certain level of revenue, they do not allow adequately for revenue that will be lost through evasion. So we're not talking about the coincidence part here. So let's see which of these other two options, these other two assumptions are being used. Let's read again. When lawmakers establish the rates, they have in mind that they will use this rate to generate this level of revenue. They don't basically consider that there will be some revenue lost due to evasion. So they do not consider this part in mind. So basically, they are not assuming that there could be some other reason why the income tax that they're getting is less as compared to what they imagined or what they expected to get. So C is the answer, C is the assumption, and how do you test it? You try to negate it. Negate it means you try to use the negative of that option. For example, if you look at option C, the opposite of that would say that when lawmakers establish the rates to generate some expected level of revenue, they do consider the revenue that is going to be lost through evasion. So if this false statement, if this opposite statement is true, it actually weakens your argument. So that means C is the correct option because the opposite of C weakens your argument. Are you all able to understand this part? How C is the answer and how do you test for C being the answer? Yeah. All right, so make sure you write this down somewhere, that in assumption questions at the end, when you are done with all the eliminations, you have an answer choice in front of you, make sure you apply this test mentally. You look at the opposite of that option and see if that opposite weakens the argument or not. Because logically, the opposite of your assumption must weaken your argument. And this is basically the basis for all the weakening questions that you get. You find the assumption and you attack it. So that was cause and effect, which is happening here. Let's move to a new pattern here, which is sampling. So this is usually done in all research studies as well. So let's say there's a clinical drug trial going on, and out of 100 people, 70 people were cured successfully. And this trial is happening in country X. And this is the premise. And you conclude that therefore, country Y should also use the same drug and cure at least 50% of its suffering population. So basically, we are using sample, and we are using that sample to conclude something about the entire population of a totally different place. So in sampling, there is usually one big assumption that whatever happens in the sample, it completely represents the entire population. And if it represents the entire population, means that it represents all other different samples taken from the same population, which means it basically represents other samples as well. So that's the first assumption. And the second assumption is that these two samples are alike. So these are the two important assumptions that you need to remember. And let's look at one question that uses sampling. Okay, so the question is again, which of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends? Let's read the argument together and then I'll give you time to solve it. Frobisher, an explorer, had soil samples from Canada's island examined for gold content. So basically this guy examined some soil samples for gold content, and high gold content was found. And because of that, Elizabeth I funded 2 mining expeditions. Neither expedition found any gold here. So basically, but the 2 following expeditions, they basically did not find any gold there. Modern analysis of the soil indicates a very low gold content, which is matching these 2 later expeditions. Thus, so this is where the conclusion starts. The methods used to determine the gold content of Frobisher's samples must have been inaccurate. So that's the conclusion. And you know there are 2 main assumptions in this kind of argument. One is that the sample represents the entire population. Second is that those 2 different samples will be alike. So go ahead, look at the options, and I'll give you 3 minutes to look at all options. And your time starts now. All right, about a minute left. All right, so tell me, what are the answers that you chose?
E.
Okay. And anyone else got a different answer? No? Okay. So let's look at option A. Now, A talks about the gold content of the soil today as compared to the 16th century. So today is definitely talking about that modern analysis of the island's soil. And it says it's lower than it was in the 16th century. But in the 16th century, Elizabeth I funded mining expeditions and neither of them found any gold. So that means in the 16th century also the amount of gold was literally zero. And basically today's analysis shows very low gold content. So A is actually doing a little opposite of what we were trying to do. So Frobisher found high content. Elizabeth's expeditions found zero content. And today, very low content is found. So A, you cannot really say A is true. So A is eliminated. Let's look at B. The two mining expeditions funded by Elizabeth did not mine the same part. Now, this is not an assumption. This is something that has the possibility of weakening the argument. Because if B is true, that means Frobisher found gold, but at some other part of the island. Elizabeth's expeditions did not find gold because they were looking at the wrong part of the island. So B is not the answer. It looks fine because it's a weakening question, weakening choice. Let's look at C. The methods used to assess gold content provided by Frobisher were different from those generally used in the 16th century. So basically, the Frobisher's method that found high gold content were different from the methods used by Elizabeth's expeditions that found zero content. So could this be an assumption for this conclusion that the methods used were inaccurate? Probably yes, because these methods used by Frobishers were completely different from the accurate methods. So C actually works well. Let's keep this. D. Frobisher did not have soil samples from any other Canadian island examined. So this is extreme. This basically says he had none of the other soil samples examined. We don't know about that, so we can't be sure. And it's extreme. Gold was not added to the soil samples before samples were examined. This also does not make sense. It's talking more about some kind of fraud that is happening, that Frobisher added gold or gold was already added. So the answer is C. So were you all able to understand how C is the answer? Any doubts in this?
I could go and get it by elimination, but if I directly look at C, it is difficult to assume this is the answer for me, at least. I don't know about others.
Yes. So that is usually true for critical reasoning. You don't sometimes get the answers directly. You need to eliminate the options that don't work and then look at the remaining options and then see which one of them is more accurate. So, okay, so that is sampling. So the sample over here was basically two different samples. One was Frobisher's sample, one was the expedition's sample. So that was sampling being used here and the comparison between samples. Let's move to the next kind of pattern that is there in CR, which is plans. So plans is something like you saw in the piano question. So let's take a simple plan of a GMAT student. So let's say you solve 1,000 sentence correction questions. That means you'll be able to get 100% accuracy in sentence correction. Now, one basic big assumption in this plan, which again, it's more of a common sense assumption, is that the plan will work. So any argument, any option that shows that there's a potential problem in this plan is going to weaken this argument. So that's the first assumption, that the plan will work. And the second is, even if there is a problem that exists, there is a solution readily available to take care of that problem. So this is pretty basic, these two assumptions. Let's look at one question and solve it. Okay, so the question is again assumption question. Let's look at the argument. Millions of irreplaceable exhibits in natural history museums are currently allowed to decay. So that is what is happening right now. Exhibits are allowed to decay currently, yet, so these are important words, you should never miss reading them. Yet, without analysis of eggs from museums, the studies linking pesticides with decline of birds of prey would have been impossible. So this is basically a very important study that happened because those exhibits, they helped find this conclusion. Therefore, funds must be raised to preserve at least those exhibits that will be most valuable to science in the future. So this is the entire plan, to raise funds to preserve those exhibits that will be most valuable to science. So again, the basic assumptions are two, that the plan will work, and second, if there's a problem, a potential problem, there is a solution already in place. So let's go through these options one by one. If a museum exhibit is irreplaceable, that means very valuable, its preservation is of an importance that overrides economic considerations. Now, definitely this is not true, because we have to raise funds. Funds must be raised. That means right now we are looking at the economic considerations, and the benefits, they do not override those economic considerations. So A is eliminated because it's doing the opposite of what the argument says. B, the scientific analysis of exhibits can be performed in non-destructive way. We're not talking about destruction or non-destruction at all. We're not talking about the methods, so B is out of scope. So let me write that down here. C, eggs of extinct species should be analyzed to increase knowledge of genetic relationships among species. Now, this is a totally nonsense answer because it does not do anything. And it's just added there as one of the extra options. D, it can be known at this time what data will be of most use to scientific investigators in the future. And E, the decay of organic material in natural history exhibits is natural and cannot be prevented. Now, I leave it to you. Make a choice between D and E. Which one do you think is the answer?
D.
D. Okay, and Lakshmi?
Give me 1 second. I'm just still reading it.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll go with D.
Okay, D is the answer, because if you apply the negation test, if you look at the opposite of D, that you cannot really know right now what will be most useful, this whole plan is going to fail. So this whole argument is going to get weakened. So D is definitely important for the argument to exist, and D is the assumption. E is wrong because it says the decay, it is natural and it cannot be prevented. So E is basically weakening the argument. It says no matter how many funds you raise, it's not going to work. So E is doing the opposite of what we want, and D is the answer. And the next kind of pattern that you see is percentages and numbers. So let me take another example here. So you have two hospitals. You have hospital H, and you have hospital G. In hospital H, so we are talking about doctors who treat a particular infectious disease. So we say in hospital H, about 500 of those doctors, they actually contracted that same disease which they were treating. And in hospital G, only 200 doctors contracted that disease that they were treating. And on the basis of this information, we are concluding that hospital G does a better job in preventing doctors from contracting that disease. Now, I want you to find a loophole in this particular argument. Some kind of information that is missing, but is very important to know.
The population size as well.
Yes, so you need to know how many doctors actually treated those infectious diseases. So what if you had 500 doctors who treated the infectious diseases here and 10,000 over here? So definitely in that case, the argument gets strengthened that hospital G is definitely better because out of 10,000, only 200 got the disease. And in hospital H, out of 500, all of them got the disease. But what if you reverse it? What if you say out of 10,000, only 500 contracted in H, but out of 500, almost half of them contracted in G? In that case, the argument gets weakened. So that means it's not a very strong argument to begin with, and it is resting on this particular assumption. Or rather, the assumption is that, let's say, the number of doctors who treated infectious diseases was comparable in both of them. So that's going to be the basic assumption in this case. So basically, if you have percentages and numbers in your options and arguments, the assumption is that all that information is comparable and transferable from one mode or one unit of analysis to the other unit of analysis. Let's try one question here together. So again, the question is, the climatologist's argument depends on which of the following assumptions? So it says global warming is affecting snowfall throughout the state. In 2004, 60% of the precipitation was in the form of snow, whereas by 2009, that percentage had dropped to 42% of the precipitation was in the form of snow. At this rate, in 20-30 years, the state may have no snow at all. So basically, they're concluding that the amount of snow has also reduced, just because the percentage of the precipitation which is formed by snow has reduced. So I want you to go through these options because this is a comparatively easier question than the previous ones. And I'll give you about 1.5 minutes to make a choice. And be aware of the extreme options. Okay. Anyone got an answer for this?
D.
Okay. So
Confused with B and E.
okay.
No, D and E.
Or E. Okay. So let's look at A then. So A is something that we are not sure about. It's not an assumption. It does not matter if it decreases at a linear rate or not. So A is eliminated. C, not the only factor affecting the state's snowfall yield, so that basically weakens our entire argument. And it also has a little bit of the cause and effect element here, that global warming leads to less snowfall. Okay, B, global warming will cease to be a factor over the next 20 to 30 years. Now this is weakening as well as it's a very strong option. So B is gone. D, the amount of precipitation was not greater than it had been in 2004. That means basically in 2009, so this was not happening, was not significantly greater. This can work because now we need to know what was the total amount of precipitation that happened. Maybe the total base figure of 2009 was quite big and the amount of snow was equal in both these years. That could have happened. So this is an important assumption, definitely. E, the volume of rainfall. So it talks about volume of rainfall was not higher, but it does not actually give us numbers or give us the information that is enough for us to make this an assumption. It's just talking about higher and lower, and it's talking about volume of rainfall. So that is not really important. The answer is going to be D. Okay, so I think both of you, do you have any doubt in this? No?
No.
Okay. All right, so let's move ahead. So this is basically what the scratch paperwork looked like for this particular argument. So we've eliminated options A, B, and C, and E because of these strong reasons. So D is basically saying that you're assuming everything else was the same, which is fine. So we don't have a lot of time in today's class, but I'll still give you a couple of questions to solve, and you get 2 minutes for this question. Okay, so does anyone have an answer?
D.
Okay, and Lakshmi, what about you?
B.
Okay, I think you're both correct. So D is the answer. So I quickly go through this argument. So to cut down construction costs, the contractor is going to use a new alternative sealant. Critics say it's a risk to buildings because of the sealant. But again, the contractor has said that buildings can withstand up to 10 tons of load per story, and no building actually has that kind of load. So there's no safety risk. So it's basically a debate going on between critics and the contractor. You have chosen D. The strength has similar longevity as that of the original proposed sealant, which basically means that both kinds of sealants are the same in terms of how long their strength lasts, which is absolutely correct. Let's eliminate the other options. Residents will be made to know something, not really relevant. Same physical and chemical characteristics, not relevant. We are more worried about the strength and the risk. Buildings have found to be safe in a recent audit performed by the state government. No, not really an assumption. It's more like an extraneous fact. And the load faced is increasing at an alarming rate. This is basically weakening the argument. So yes, E is wrong. All right, let's try this as the last question for today. 2 minutes. Okay, so I've already eliminated 2 options which were like obviously blatantly wrong. So out of B, C, and D, which one is your choice? Anyone? Lakshmi, Priyanka?
I'm stuck with multiple answers. I'm
Okay.
still reading.
All right. So you can take a minute more. Okay, so I've eliminated C as well because you can't really say it's not an assumption. It's more like a fictional answer. What if it were true then? But C is definitely not an assumption. So it's out of B and D, and I think it'll be easier now to make a choice. So which one?
B.
D. It is. It is actually B.
That's what I said B.
Okay. Okay. So B is fine because D talks about more than one crime. We are just talking about guilty versus not guilty. So it doesn't matter how many crimes they committed, and that is why D is irrelevant. B completely matches what the conclusion is saying. They were much less likely to have committed their crime than the non-volunteers. So basically, they're more likely to be innocent. That's the assumption. Because if you negate this B, the whole argument again falls apart. So that is why B is the answer. And whenever you're stuck between two options, try to negate the options. I know it's the beginning of your prep and you will need more time here. So don't worry at all about how much time you're spending on a question, but make sure you understand every important part of that entire question and all options. So don't time yourself when you practice nowadays, but eventually as we go to the 4th class, to the 5th class and 6th class, try timing yourself. So since we are almost out of time, we won't be doing any more of these questions, but I'll just tell you what we'll do in the next class. So we will be doing practice and some hard questions practice on the errors we've already done. And we'll be looking at assumptions and strengthening questions in CR. And we will begin reading comprehension, and we'll also talk about mapping the passages. How do you read the passages quickly in 4 minutes? Okay, so that's all for the class today, and I'll be posting the study material online in the course curriculum. If you have any questions, you can email at any time at this email address, which is support@perfectscores.org. And if you have any question right now for me or any feedback or any doubt, anything, you can go ahead.
Hi.
I'm good. Thank you
Can
so
you hear
much.
me?
Okay, so I'll share this recording as well online. Hello, yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to know that where can I access this material?
So when you go to the course curriculum, so you will have different modules for class 1, class 2, class 3. So you will have a video recording of the class, and beneath that you will have the PDF files.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, all right. Welcome. Okay, so if that's all, I'll just go ahead and finish the class. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah,
This session.
yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.